Welcome to Books in Five, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author 5 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written a tremendous new biography about one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. Please tell us your full name, the title of your book, and a little bit more about your bio.
Thanks, Pavan. My name is Benn Steil. I'm Senior Fellow and Director of International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York.
Ben, let's begin with our first question. Henry Wallace's background and his life before politics is interesting because it sets up his entire life. Help us understand his upbringing, the people that motivated him, and the events that shaped his character before he went into politics.
Henry Wallace was born in 1888, about 5 miles outside of the small town of Orient, Iowa, which is about 64 miles southwest of Des Moines. He grew up in a not well-to-do, but highly respected farm family. His grandfather was the founder of an extremely reputable national farm journal known as Wallace's Farmer. So this was at a time when, about 40% of the American population was involved in agriculture. So a publication like this was something akin to what Barron's was to the financial markets in the 1980s. His father took over editorship of the journal when his grandfather died, and then Henry took over the editorship in the 1920s when his father became agriculture secretary under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. Wallace was also a very accomplished agricultural geneticist. And in fact, much of the corn that we consume today is an outgrowth of his early experiments in hybridization of crops, particularly corn, which produced a hardier, sturdier, more abundant yield. And in fact, the company he created in order to do this hybridization was sold to DuPont in 1999 for $9.5 billion. But in the 1920s, it was a pretty small enterprise. He came to prominence in 1933 because FDR, who was running for president for the first time in 32, was looking for a promising new agriculture secretary. The United States, of course, was in the midst of a depression, and the agricultural region of the United States was particularly hard hit. And Wallace was somebody who seemed to have both the expertise and the ambitions to pursue radical policies. You asked about the influences on his life. He's a rather remarkable individual. He comes from a scientific bent, as you can see from his experiments with agricultural genetics. But he was also a spiritualist, and he experimented with many different religions. And in particular, he became a devotee of the American psychologist, philosopher William James, who had controversially argued that it was often rational to believe without evidence because there were certain things that were simply unknowable, and we had to act as if we knew that it was true in order to see whether, in fact, our suppositions about the world were true. Henry Wallace very much took this to heart, and it came to influence very significantly how he dealt with political issues, particularly in the area of foreign relations.
We have about 90 more seconds with this question. Can you talk a little bit more about the eccentric gurus that he surrounded or he was involved with?
Yes, so Wallace in the late 1920s became a devotee of a revolutionary white Russian artist and mystic named Nicholas Roerich, who had just established himself in New York. And for all intents and purposes, Wallace's devotion became cult-like. In the early 1930s, he started writing him and his wife, who claimed to be able to speak through the ether to the ancient Mahatmas, absorbing their eternal wisdom. He began corresponding with them in very obsequious, almost fawning terms, using salutations like dear Guru or oh great father.
Ben, let's move on to our second question. You showcase how Wallace served in critically important positions throughout FDR's administration, including as vice president. What was he doing on the domestic front during the trying years of the Great Depression and during World War II?
So throughout the 1930s, this is Roosevelt's first two terms. So we're talking from 1933 to 1940. Wallace was Agriculture Secretary, and he was an extremely radical one. He presided over massive growth in the department. It became by far the biggest department of government with over 140,000 employees. And he doled out over his two terms as agricultural secretary the equivalent in today's dollars of $1.2 trillion in farm subsidies and supports. Some of his policies were very radical and very controversial. In order to boost farm prices, for example, he required farmers not only to stop planting, but to dig up cotton and other plants that had already been planted, and required the premature killing of 6 million hogs, which, as you can imagine, was extremely controversial. And that decision often came back to haunt him throughout his career, as Republican opponents used to remind the population of his policies. Um, but he was there at a time when there was a recovery of sorts in the farm belt. So even to this day, there are many who believe that he was a successful agriculture secretary. Um, During the early part of Roosevelt's first term, however, Wallace was involved in a rather remarkable episode involving his guru, Nicholas Roerich. He basically lied to Congress and deceived FDR in many capacities, saying he was going to send Roerich off on a seed foraging expedition in Central Asia to bring back drought-resistant seeds for the Dust Bowl, the Farm Belt in the United States. This was actually a cover for Nicholas Roerich to try to create a new theocratic state in Central Asia that would arrogate territory from Russian Siberia, Soviet Siberia, from Mongolia, from China, and the parts of China, Manchuria, occupied by Japan. And this almost brought about World War II a bit earlier than it actually did come about. And so this, as you know from reading the book, came close to destroying Wallace's career several times. Because the letters that he wrote to his guru and the guru's wife did surface, and were used against him to hold that he was a radical mystic. So that's what he did in the 30s. In 1940, he became Roosevelt's very controversial pick as vice presidential nominee. He was so controversial within the party at that point that Roosevelt had to insist that he wouldn't run unless Wallace was nominated as his running mate. And Wallace was not allowed to make an acceptance speech because the conference, DNC conference chairman, Jimmy Burns, was afraid that he would in fact be booed down. So he was a controversial pick. During his term as vice president from 41 to 44, he was given significant administrative responsibilities. He was head of the so-called um, Bureau of Economic Warfare. Board of Economic Warfare. And in this role, he in fact warred with the Commerce Secretary, who controlled an extremely large fiefdom within the administration, Jesse Jones. Jesse Jones was a conservative Texan. Wallace was a progressive Democrat. They fought basically over war procurement, which was an extremely sensitive area in the 40s. Wallace was willing to pay anything to get rubber and other commodities immediately. Jesse Jones argued that was pushing up the prices of commodities that the United States needed. Eventually, FDR became sick of the whole process of watching them war in public and eliminated this fiefdom of Wallace's in 43. And that was really the pinnacle of his responsibilities under FDR.
Let's move on to our third question. The book recounts Wallace's tour of Siberia and China in 1944 in superb detail. Can you tell us what took place on this trip and Wallace's worldview regarding these two countries before and after his visit?
Yeah, so Wallace became a controversial figure in foreign affairs during his tenure as vice president. He began making speeches calling for an enduring cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union after the war, an alliance of sorts. And he continuously praised what he called the Soviet Union's economic democracy. As you can imagine, this made him quite controversial within the U.S. government and U.S. society more widely. He wanted very much to go into foreign affairs. He saw himself as Roosevelt's rightful successor. And in March of 1944, he asked Roosevelt if he could go to Moscow on a diplomatic mission. Roosevelt would not let him get anywhere near Joseph Stalin, but came up with another idea, very Rooseveltian idea. DNC leaders were wanting to push Wallace off the ticket because they could tell that FDR was not going to survive a fourth term, and they knew whoever was going to be vice president was also going to become president. Roosevelt had accepted that Wallace should go off the ticket in favor of someone who would be less controversial within the party, but he didn't have the guts to look Wallace in the face and tell him so. So he asked him to go to China on a modest diplomatic mission to reassure Chiang Kai-shek that he was still very much in FDR's mind, but he wanted Wallace to encourage Jiang to stop fighting the Chinese communists and start combining their forces against the Japanese invaders. But he suggested to Wallace that Wallace might usefully go through Siberia on his way to China. And that was a rather remarkable journey. Wallace spent 4 years traipsing through Siberia. The Soviets spent an enormous amount of money building a Potemkin continent for him to see. This is the Gulag Archipelago. And the Soviets managed to hide all this from him. And Wallace quite foolishly wrote a book together with an American NKGB journalist source praising Soviet accomplishments in Asia. As you can imagine, this made him an even more controversial figure and came back to haunt him later in his career. He then went on to China, where he met with Chiang Kai-shek. I was not expecting this to be a long chapter because he didn't accomplish anything of particular note, at least nothing in the official record. But it turned out that the Russian archives revealed that the Soviets were spying heavily on him, and that he had had offline discussions with Chiang Kai-shek, urging him to make major territorial and commercial concessions to the Soviets in the post-war period in order to produce wider international cooperation. And this actually encouraged Stalin to extend his occupation of Manchuria after the Soviet invasion of China, ostensibly just to rid it of Japanese forces in August of 1944. So Wallace may have, by taking the Soviet line with the Chinese, sped the rise to power of the Chinese Communist Party, who came to first dominate Manchuria because of the fact that the Soviets were controlling it.
Ben, let's move on to our fourth question. My favorite chapter is titled History's Pivot, as it depicts Wallace's path to potentially becoming the American president. Walk us through the events of the 1944 Democratic Convention and how you think he would have governed the nation.
So, as I said earlier, FDR accepted the argument of the DNC leaders that Wallace should go off the ticket in favor of somebody who'd be less controversial within the party. But he didn't have the guts to look Wallace in the face and tell him to go. So he sent emissaries to tell him to go. And that wouldn't do for Wallace. Wallace insisted he wouldn't leave the ticket. He was going to run for vice president unless Roosevelt himself said he did not want him. So Roosevelt, again in classic Roosevelt style, actually endorsed 4 separate people for vice president in 4 separate ways. This, as you can imagine, caused complete and utter chaos at the convention. And we had a wild, open convention for vice president in which Wallace was actually leading after the first ballots. You remember the drama at the convention where the delegates area on the ground floor was invaded by Wallace supporters from the peanut gallery chanting, "We want Wallace, we want Wallace." But the DNC leaders managed to get control of the process, this quite dramatic process, got things to a second vote on the next day of the convention, at which Truman took the lead, and Harry Truman became the nominee. And this really, I argue, changed history because FDR died in April of 1945. His vice president did indeed become president, Harry Truman. Truman kept Wallace on in his cabinet as Commerce Secretary. That was a gift that Roosevelt had given to Wallace as a sort of concession after he was pushed off the ticket. Truman kept him on the ticket in order to secure his liberal flank within the party. And remarkably, Wallace survived in the position for a year and a half. But during much of that time, he was attacking Truman's foreign policy. Wallace became extremely pro-Soviet at this point, was taking the Soviet line on very sensitive issues, for example, atomic disarmament, testing, etc. And Truman finally pushed him out of government in September of 1946. Now, if Wallace had stayed as vice president and become president, we would be living in a different world today. Because Wallace staunchly opposed all of Truman's major foreign policy initiatives, the so-called Truman Doctrine to protect countries who were being subjected to foreign aggression, particularly from the Soviet Union. He was against military aid to Greece and Turkey. He was against containment policy. He was against the creation of West Germany. He was against the Marshall Plan. He was against the creation of NATO. So really, it would have been a quite different world if Henry Wallace had become president.
Ben, let's move on to our concluding question. Wallace stayed in the public sphere by first running for president in 1948 with the help of Stalin, and then repudiating his affinity towards Moscow. What is your assessment on why he changed his outlook and rhetoric towards the USSR?
So Wallace decided to run for president against Harry Truman in 1948, leading a new progressive party that adopted him as their leader. This was a very controversial move on Wallace's part because the Progressive Party, although it did have committed liberals who left the Democratic Party in order to support Wallace's campaign, found its apparatus was actually taken over by the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, and was being significantly influenced by Moscow. I discovered that in the spring of 1948, Wallace engaged in secret discussions with Joseph Stalin, having covert meetings with Stalin's UN ambassador, Andrei Gromyko, in which Wallace proposed to go to the Soviet Union and reach an agreement on all issues of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Wallace believed that would convince the American public that the Cold War was all the fault of Harry Truman, and that he, Henry Wallace, as president, could end it. Stalin turned out to be a bit politically more shrewd than Wallace decided. Wallace visiting Moscow was not a good idea, but he encouraged Wallace to write what Wallace had called an open letter to him, which Stalin helped draft. As you see in the book, I actually have Stalin's handwritten edits on one of Wallace's draft texts. So Wallace would read out this open letter at Madison Square Garden, which he did on May 11th, and Wallace would then later endorse this document. It actually served to make Wallace less popular at the time with the American public, not more popular, because the public was turning even more staunchly anti-Soviet in its outlook than the Truman administration. So this may have actually helped Harry Truman look tougher against his Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey. And of course, we know Truman famously did make a big comeback and win in November. Now, Wallace at this point is extremely bitter at what he considers to be a betrayal by Moscow, which will have nothing to do with him after he gets destroyed in this campaign, getting 0 electoral votes, barely more than 2% of the votes, a little more than a million votes, popular votes in total. And he becomes very bitter when he finally accepts that the American communists had basically taken over his campaign and his party. And he's looking for a pretext, as it were, to separate from them. And he finds it in the Korean War. In June of 1950, when the North Korean forces invade the South. Wallace says quite disingenuously that when my country and the United Nations are of the same mind about the need to protect the South Koreans, I am with the United States and the United Nations. Of course, the only reason that the UN Security Council authorized a UN force in Korea was because the Soviets had stormed out of the Security Council. But at this point, Wallace becomes quite anti-Soviet in his rhetoric, and in 1952, he produces a rather remarkable mea culpa in the New York Times called "Where I Was Wrong," claiming that what had ultimately convinced him that Moscow could not be an ally of the United States was members of the Progressive Party from a Czech background who had finally persuaded him that the communist coup in February of 48 in Czechoslovakia was in fact instigated by the Soviets and had not in fact been caused by quote unquote rightist forces, which is the term that Wallace had used for the Democrats in Czechoslovakia in 48. Again, this appears to be completely disingenuous. It was widely known that the Soviets had instigated this coup, but it allowed Wallace to begin his separation from what he considered to be a very unfortunate episode in his career. He went back to farming in his quiet farm in Westchester, New York, and began his experiments in agricultural genetics again. For example, producing a strain of chickens that ate less and laid more eggs. And he basically recanted about politics. He I think, regretted ever having gone into politics. He was certainly not a natural politician. He had many of the characteristics that we associate with Asperger's today. He had great difficulty in social situations. So really, Wallace is a quite remarkable figure. I've sold the film rights to the book, so I'm hoping eventually to be able to bring it to the silver screen, and I think it'll be a fascinating story to be told in movie form.
Ben, that has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Let's move on to our bonus question. Ben, tell us a little bit more about your career trajectory. How did you get to where you are?
So I have economics degrees from the Wharton School undergraduate, University of Pennsylvania, and master's and DPhil from Oxford. After that, I decided I wanted to work in political economy. I was always very fascinated with foreign affairs. So I became a senior fellow at Chatham House in London, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is a very similar place to where I am now, the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. In 1999, CFR recruited me, and I've been here ever since. I am here senior fellow and director of international economics. It might seem an unusual thing that an economist would be writing a political biography of Henry Wallace. How did that evolution come about? Well, several books ago, I had written an historical narrative on the Bretton Woods conference of 1944 and the offshoots of it, the creation of the IMF, the World Bank, dollar-based financial system. And I got addicted to early Cold War politics when I made a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI for information on Harry Dexter White, who was the Treasury representative who basically put together the conference. There have been accusations that he was a major Soviet asset. The FBI gave me 13,000 pages on White, and that was, a big beginning of a new career trajectory. I still do quite conventional economics here at the council, but I also write on Cold War history and have made considerable use of Soviet archival material to write my more recent books on the Marshall Plan and then Wallace.
Obviously, the book is a major achievement, but maybe we want to get more into another accomplishment that you're most proud of.
Yeah, I've had a quarter century now here at the Council on Foreign Relations, and one of the most wonderful things about working here is working with the young people that pass through as interns and research associates, and watching them go on to bigger and greater things when they leave. And I'd like to think that I was able to make a positive contribution to pushing them off into their bigger careers. I think the thing I'm most proud about is one of my previous analysts here at CFR, who then went to Yale Law School and then into the White House at the National Economic Council. So, became an important figure in economic policy making in his own right. And a mutual friend came to see me at one point, told me that he had just spoken to him in Washington, and he said that the thing that he learned that was most valuable from working with Ben was how to write. And I consider that, a great accomplishment. And I love tutoring, mentoring interns and analysts and research associates here. It's extremely gratifying.
Last question for you. What are you working on next?
So I'm writing a book that sort of combines the interests that were built into my last three books. The creation of the American one world foreign policy vision in the 1940s, how it was undermined by a combination of the Soviets and the Chinese. How that one world vision was revived after the end of the Cold War, the sort of Fukuyama end of history thesis that the world was moving towards inexorably towards liberal democracy, and how that one world vision has once again been undermined by a combination of the Chinese and the Russians, and some reflections about where the world is headed politically, and how the experience of the 1940s can illuminate that.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us on Books in Five. Again, the title of the book is The World That Wasn't. It is an excellent biography about Henry Wallace. If you're not able to buy it, definitely check it out from your local library. I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. It is a very, very good read. Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
The host of Books in Five is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in Five is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.